My name is Hazel. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe with safe words: reliable, calm, easy to work with. The kind of colleague managers trust to handle things quietly. The kind who stays late without being asked, not because I'm trying to impress anyone, but because I believe work should be done properly, especially when your name is attached to it. If you'd asked people who knew me back then how they saw me, they probably would have said I was steady. Not ambitious in an obvious way, not loud, not political, someone who didn't need much supervision and didn't make trouble. And in an office that rewarded visibility more than substance, that perception mattered more than I realized at the time. This story isn't about a dramatic betrayal or a single villain. There's no shouting match, no public humiliation, no triumphant revenge scene. It's about something quieter and much more common. It's about staying late every night, doing work that mattered, believing that effort would eventually be noticed, and then watching someone else, a colleague who understood the rules better than I did, walk away with the promotion that seemed inevitable to me. For a long time, I thought what happened was just bad luck. Office politics, timing, one of those unfair things you're supposed to accept and move on from. But when I look back now, with distance and clarity, I see a pattern, a slow erosion, small moments that didn't feel important enough to challenge. I was made to stay quiet because it felt professional, because it felt mature, because I told myself that integrity would speak for itself. This story is about how that belief was tested and what happened when I stopped mistaking silence for virtue. Over the course of this video, I'll take you through the version of me that existed then, how I was perceived, what role I quietly accepted, and the moment I realized that working harder inside the same invisible box wouldn't change the outcome. You'll hear about the subtle shifts that followed, not confrontations, not schemes, but deliberate choices made without announcements. I'm not telling this to stir anger or invite sympathy. I'm telling it because many of us have lived some version of it, especially in environments where fairness is spoken about more than it's practiced. And because there's a difference between being patient and being positioned. What happened to me didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something, not as a hook, but as a genuine question. Have you ever looked back at a moment you stayed quiet and wondered whether it cost you more than you were willing to admit? In that office, I was known before I was understood. People knew my habits, that I arrived early, usually before the lights on the east side of the floor were fully on. That I stayed late long after the last meeting room emptied and the cleaners started their slow circuit. They knew I answered emails thoroughly, that my documents rarely came back with comments, that if something went wrong in a process, I could usually explain why without blaming anyone. What they didn't know was me. To most of my colleagues, I existed as a function, a dependable one. I was the person managers copied when they wanted certainty. The one junior staff were told to check with before submitting something final. I wasn't excluded. I was included in a very specific way, usefully, quietly, predictably. I didn't mind that at first. There's a comfort in being trusted. And early in my career, I believed trust naturally led to opportunity. I believed that if you became indispensable, recognition would follow. That if you removed friction for everyone else, someone would eventually notice the cost you absorbed. In meetings, I spoke when I had something precise to add. I didn't repeat what others had already said just to be heard. I didn't interrupt. I waited for pauses that often never came. When my suggestions were acknowledged, they were folded into the group discussion without attribution. When they weren't, I let it go. I told myself the outcome mattered more than credit. Looking back, I can see how that shaped the story others told about me. I was solid. Low maintenance. Not really management material, but excellent support. That last phrase was never said directly. It didn't need to be. It lived in tone, in who was asked to lead and who was asked to assist. In those who were invited into follow-up conversations and who were thanked afterward for holding things together. There was no cruelty in it. That's important. No one woke up intending to sideline me. The system simply responded to what it could see. and what it could see was someone who made things work without asking for anything in return. I remember one performance review where my manager leaned back in his chair and said, "Honestly, Hazel, you make my job easier." He meant it as praise. I smiled and thanked him. At the time, I didn't hear the other half of that sentence. "And you don't make me rethink anything." I became the person on whom assumptions were built. Those reports would be accurate, that deadlines would be met, those problems would be solved before they escalated. When new initiatives came up, I was assigned the parts that required precision and follow-through, not visibility. It wasn't that I lacked ambition, I just didn't perform it the way others did. I didn't narrate my workload. I didn't frame every contribution as leadership potential. I thought consistency spoke for itself. There was another colleague, Evan, who joined around the same time I did. He was competent, personable, and very good at being seen. He asked questions out loud that many of us already knew the answers to. He summarized discussions that weren't his to summarize. He volunteered to coordinate things that I later executed. People noticed him because he placed himself where noticing was easy. I noticed him too. Not with resentment, with mild curiosity. I assumed we were playing different roles on the same team, and that those roles would eventually be evaluated fairly. From the outside, my career looked stable. From the inside, it felt like standing still while moving constantly. Every year, more responsibility. Same title, same unspoken expectations. If you'd asked me then whether I felt invisible, I would have said no. Invisible people are ignored. I was relied upon. But reliance without recognition is its own kind of erasure. You don't disappear. You become background. And the most dangerous thing about being background is that no one notices when you stop being willing to stay there. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's why I remember it so clearly now. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, toward the end of a long project cycle. We were in one of the smaller conference rooms, the ones with glass walls that make you feel exposed even when the door is closed. I had stayed late for 3 nights straight, finalizing a process review that had been rushed into scope without additional resources. I knew the material better than anyone in the room. I had built it from the ground up. The meeting was supposed to be a walkthrough, straightforward, 15 minutes. I had just finished explaining a risk mitigation step, something I'd added quietly because I knew it would matter later. When our director nodded, looked past me and said, "Evan, can you make sure this gets implemented across teams?" There was no malice in his voice, no pause, just a seamless handoff. Evan glanced at me for half a second, not long enough to register anything. Then he said, "Yeah, absolutely," as if the work had arrived in his lap fully formed. No one corrected the framing. No one said, "Hazel designed that." No one said she should probably lead that rollout. The meeting moved on. I sat there, pen resting against my notebook, listening to a conversation about timelines for something I had already mapped out in detail. When someone asked a follow-up question, Evan answered by repeating what I'd said earlier, almost word for word. It sounded different coming from him. More decisive, more owned. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reclaim the moment. I told myself it wasn't worth derailing the meeting over something so small. I told myself leadership was about outcomes, not ego. Afterward, in the hallway, Evan said, "Nice work on that section," like you'd compliment a clean spreadsheet. Casual, friendly. I smiled and said thanks. That was the cut. Small enough that if I'd mentioned it later, it would have sounded petty. Small enough that if I'd reacted in the moment, I would have been the one making it awkward. Small enough that everyone else forgot it by the end of the day. But I didn't. I replayed it that night while packing up at 8:40 p.m. The office was quiet, except for the hum of the HVAC. I tried to explain it to myself in generous terms. They know I did the work. Titles don't matter. This will even out. What I didn't yet understand was that moments like that don't even out. They accumulate. That meeting subtly reassigned ownership. Not officially, not on paper, but in people's minds. From that point on, questions about the process went to Evan. Invitations to discuss next steps included him by default. I was copied later, looped in once decisions were already shaped. No one announced the shift. That's the thing. It happened the way erosion happens, quietly, while everyone is busy looking at something else. I kept doing the work. I refined the documentation. I fixed edge cases. I answered questions when they came my way. When someone said, "We should ask Evan," I didn't correct them. I told myself that pushing back would look territorial. I started staying later without realizing it. Not because the workload had increased dramatically, but because I was compensating, making sure nothing fell apart, protecting the quality of something that was slowly being detached from my name. If I'm honest, part of me hoped someone would notice the imbalance and step in, that a manager would say, "Wait, Hazel built this," that the system would self-correct. It didn't. The first cut didn't hurt because it was sharp. It hurt because it was subtle enough to be ignored by everyone except the person it happened to. And once something like that happens without consequence, it sets a quiet precedent. Not that you can be overlooked, but you will accept it. After that meeting, nothing changed on the surface. And that was part of the problem. The same desk, the same hours, the same polite exchanges in the kitchen while the coffee machine sputtered and complained. If anything, I was treated with more ease, less friction. People assumed I'd handle things. They spoke around me, not to me, with the casual confidence that comes when boundaries go untested. At first, I told myself I was imagining patterns. Once you notice something, you start seeing it everywhere. I didn't want to become the kind of person who kept a mental tally of slights. So every time a moment felt off, I softened it for myself. When my name was missing from an email chain about a project I had architected, I said, "They probably assumed I was too busy." When Evan presented slides that were clearly adapted from my drafts, I said, "At least the information is accurate." When a manager said, "You're such a great support for the team," I said, "Support is valuable." What I didn't say, what I didn't let myself think, was that support, in this context, was a ceiling. The repetition made it feel normal. That's how it works. Disrespect rarely arrives fully formed. It creeps in as convenience. People take the path that requires the least resistance, and I had made it very easy to route around. I became the person people came to before meetings, not during them. The one they checked assumptions with privately, then voiced their opinions. I would explain nuances, edge cases, risks, and then watch someone else simplify them into a confident statement that fit neatly into the room. They weren't stealing ideas in a dramatic way. They were filtering them, and I let them. Because every time I considered speaking up, I ran through the consequences in my head. Would this make me seem difficult, defensive, insecure? I had worked hard to build a reputation as steady and composed. I didn't want to trade that for momentary recognition. There's a particular pressure on women in professional spaces to be agreeable without being invisible, and the line between the two is thinner than people admit. I had internalized the idea that if I was good enough, if I stayed calm enough, the right people would eventually see it. So I stayed. I stayed late, I stayed quiet, I stayed helpful, and slowly, the role others assigned me became one I also assigned to myself. I stopped raising my hand for stretch opportunities because they often went elsewhere anyway. I stopped framing my work in terms of leadership and started framing it in terms of reliability. I answered questions even when they should have been someone else's responsibility. I became efficient at being overlooked. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when I felt a flicker of anger. Usually late at night, alone with my laptop, rereading an email that ended with, "Thanks, Evan," for work I had delivered hours earlier. The anger never lasted. I extinguished it with logic. This isn't personal. They don't mean harm. You don't need external validation. Those statements sound mature. They also kept me passive. What I didn't recognize then was that by normalizing these moments, I was teaching people how to treat me. Silence can look like consent when repeated often enough. The most insidious part was how polite everything remained. No one was unkind. No one raised their voice. The culture prized collaboration and professionalism, which meant discomfort was smoothed over instead of addressed. And so the pattern continued. More projects where I built the foundation and someone else stood on it. More meetings where my contributions were absorbed into the room without a name attached. More reassurance from managers that I was doing great, paired with no concrete movement forward. If you'd asked me during that period whether I felt disrespected, I probably would have hesitated. Disrespect implies intention. What I felt was something quieter, like being slowly edited out of my own work. I told myself this was temporary. Those things would shift when the right opportunity came along. What I didn't yet understand was that opportunities don't arrive for people who make it easy to overlook them. They arrive for people who are already positioned to be seen, and I was positioning everyone but myself. The realization didn't come as a shock. It came as a quiet certainty. I was sitting at my desk one evening, the office nearly empty, scrolling through an internal announcement about a new initiative, one that aligned almost perfectly with work I had been doing informally for months. The language was familiar, the goals were familiar. Even the challenges listed felt like echoes of conversations I'd had privately with my manager. The announcement named a lead. It wasn't me. It wasn't even Evan this time. It was someone from another team, charismatic, visible, well-liked, someone who spoke confidently in meetings and asked questions that framed them as strategic rather than operational. I felt a dull ache in my chest, not because I wanted that specific role, but because of what the decision confirmed. I wasn't being overlooked by accident. I had been categorized. In their minds, I was the stabilizer, the one you assign when something needs to be fixed quietly, the one who ensures continuity while others rotate through higher profile roles. I wasn't seen as someone who needed development or exposure. I was seen as someone who provided it. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction clicked into place. The way managers came to me with problems, but not possibilities. The way my calendar is filled with execution work, but not planning sessions. The way praise focused on my dependability rather than my judgment. Dependability is a compliment that can double as a trap. I realized that I had been cast in a role that served the system well, and that the system had no incentive to change it. I reduced risk. I absorbed complexity. I made other people look competent. Why would they disrupt that? What unsettled me most was recognizing my own participation in maintaining that role. I had accepted tasks without questioning the scope. I had smoothed over gaps instead of surfacing them. I had allowed others to speak for work I could have claimed, not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed that good work would eventually transcend optics. That belief had become my blind spot. There was a moment during a one-on-one with my manager when he said, "You're such a backbone for the team." I nodded, smiled, and thanked him. Inside, something hardened. A backbone supports. It doesn't move forward. It doesn't decide direction. It bears weight so others can stand upright. I went home that night and opened my notebook, the leather-bound one I'd been carrying for years, not to vent, to observe. I started writing down what I was actually responsible for versus what my role description said. Which meetings was invited to? Which decisions I influenced informally but never formally owned? The list was longer than I expected, and for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided. If I continue exactly like this, what is the most likely outcome? The answer wasn't failure. It was stagnation. I would remain employed, respected, and unadvanced, valued but not elevated, trusted but not chosen. That was the role. Reliable, useful, invisible. Understanding that didn't make me angry. It made it clear. Clarity is uncomfortable when it removes your excuses. I couldn't blame office politics anymore, or timing, or personalities. I could see the structure, and I could see my place within it. And once you see the role you've been assigned, you have two options: perform it better, or step out of it. That night, for the first time in a long while, I didn't stay late to finish someone else's problem. I shut down my computer at a reasonable hour and walked out into the cool evening air. Nothing had changed yet, but something had shifted. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. There was no argument, no decisive conversation where I finally said the right thing. It happened on an ordinary morning in an unremarkable moment that would have looked insignificant to anyone else. I was reviewing a draft proposal Evan had sent late the night before. My name was in the CC line, not as a contributor, just as someone to keep informed. The document referenced several process efficiencies I had designed months earlier. The language was confident, the framing was strategic. My work, once again, had been translated into a narrative that wasn't mine. I noticed something new, not the familiar irritation, but distance. I read the document carefully, the way I always did. I saw a flaw in the logic. Not a small one, a structural assumption that would hold in the short term and fail under scale. I knew this because I had tested the scenario quietly, months ago, when no one else thought it was necessary. Normally, I would have replied immediately, pointed out the issue, suggested a fix, protected the outcome. Instead, I closed the document. I didn't do it out of spite. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt neutral. For the first time, I asked myself, is this actually my responsibility? No one had asked for my input. No one had acknowledged my ownership. I was being kept informed, not consulted. And I realized how often I had blurred that line voluntarily, offering labor where none was formally requested, stepping in before gaps became visible. That morning, I made coffee and sat with the discomfort of not intervening. It was subtle, but it was the moment something inside me recalibrated. I went to work and did exactly what was asked of me. Nothing more, nothing less. I answered questions directed to me. I delivered what was on my task list. When conversations drifted into areas I had historically covered without invitation, I stayed quiet. No one noticed. That was the confirmation. I had believed that my constant presence was essential, that my vigilance was preventing collapse. But the system didn't even register my absence as an absence. Things moved forward, slightly less polished, slightly more fragile, but forward nonetheless. And in that realization was an unexpected relief. That day I didn't feel invisible. I felt untethered. I stopped narrating my choices through the lens of how they might be perceived. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I wasn't planning an exit or a confrontation. I was simply adjusting my relationship to my own energy. In the afternoon, my manager stopped by my desk and asked, "Everything okay? You've been quieter than usual." I looked up, met his eyes, and said, "Yes, just focused." It was true, focused on observing rather than compensating, on listening rather than anticipating, on understanding the system as it actually operated, not as I thought it should. I noticed how often my silence was filled by others without hesitation, how decisions were made with incomplete information because the person who held it wasn't expected to speak unless prompted, how risk tolerance shifted when the safety net quietly loosened. I went home that evening and wrote a single sentence in my notebook. Silence is only a weakness if you're afraid of what happens without you. That was the day something shifted, not in my circumstances, but in my posture. I wasn't withdrawing. I was reclaiming choice. And from that point on, silence wasn't something that happened to me. It was something I used deliberately. Once I realized silence could be chosen, not endured, I became very intentional about it. Not dramatic, not obvious. I didn't suddenly refuse tasks or withdraw from collaboration. I simply stopped filling space that wasn't explicitly mine. I waited to be asked. I let pauses remain pauses. I answered questions directly, without offering extensions or anticipatory fixes. To anyone watching casually, it probably looked like fatigue, or disengagement, or maybe even a loss of confidence. That misinterpretation worked in my favor. People began to underestimate me more openly. Meetings moved faster without my careful qualifiers. Decisions were made with a sense of ease that comes from mistaking simplicity for clarity. And because nothing broke immediately, my reduced presence was interpreted as proof that I hadn't been as central as I once seemed. Evan, in particular, grew more comfortable. He spoke with more certainty, delegated more freely, and summarized discussions more aggressively. He filled the space I left without realizing why it had been there. I watched quietly. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was to this shift. No one asked what I thought about changes to processes I had built. No one checked whether I agreed with the interpretations of my past work. They assumed alignment because I had always provided it. Silence once expected becomes permission. At the same time, I began redirecting my attention, not outward, no visible networking or self-promotion, inward. I reviewed years of work I had done, process documents, decision logs, and informal analyses sent via email. I noticed how often I had flagged risks that were later resolved quietly without acknowledgement. I started organizing those records, not to weaponize them, to understand the pattern of value flow, where insight originated and where credit landed. This wasn't about catching anyone out. It was about seeing clearly. I also began asking different questions in one-on-ones. Not, how can I help more, but what outcomes are you accountable for this quarter? Not where do you need support, but how are decisions being evaluated at the next level? The answers were revealing. I learned that promotions weren't tied to reliability. They were tied to narrative, to perceived ownership, to be associated with successful initiatives, not just enabling them. That wasn't bitterness-inducing, it was instructive. So I continued choosing silence in rooms where my voice would only reinforce someone else's authority. I saved my input for moments where it would be explicitly attributed or documented. I stopped volunteering insights in real time and started sharing them in writing, with clear framing and timestamps. People didn't push back, they adapted. And in their adaptation, they revealed assumptions I hadn't seen before. That I would always catch things, that I would always be available, that I didn't need recognition because I wasn't seeking advancement. Those assumptions created blind spots. Meanwhile, I watched how quickly confidence filled the vacuum where diligence once lived, how language became more optimistic, how caveats disappeared, how timelines tightened without corresponding safeguards. None of this was my doing. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply no longer compensating for structural overconfidence. The irony was that the quieter I became, the more information I gained. When you're not constantly intervening, people speak more freely around you. They reveal what they assume you won't challenge. I learned who was protected, who was visible, and who was quietly replaceable. And I learned something else, something uncomfortable but important. They didn't think my silence meant I was planning anything. They thought it meant I had accepted my place. That assumption gave me space. Space to prepare. Space to decide. Space to stop reacting and start positioning. Silence had once been my default. Now it was my leverage. What they never noticed was how much I was still paying attention. When you stop performing helpfulness in real time, people assume you've disengaged. They don't consider that you might be reallocating effort rather than withdrawing it. My calendar looked lighter. My contributions looked narrower. But my awareness had sharpened. I began treating the workplace the way an analyst treats a system, mapping inputs, outputs, incentives, and failure points. Not emotionally, methodically. I documented everything, not in a way that would alarm anyone. No secret files, no dramatic spreadsheets titled evidence. Just clean, chronological notes in my leather-bound notebook and organized folders on my drive. Dates, decisions, who proposed what, who approved it, where risks had been flagged, and by whom. I wasn't building a case against a person. I was building a picture of how credit and accountability were distributed. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped interfering with them. I saw how ideas moved upward once they were simplified enough to be owned. How uncertainty was filtered out before reaching leadership. How the same people were repeatedly positioned as decision makers, even when they relied heavily on unseen contributors. And I saw how often my name appeared in the background, attachments, drafts, email chains, without ever making it into the story told afterward. At the same time, I started learning deliberately. Not new technical skills. I already had those. I studied organizational behavior, leadership signaling, and internal mobility frameworks. I read performance criteria documents more closely than I ever had. I paid attention to how promoted people talked about their work versus how they actually did it. I noticed that advancement wasn't about doing more. It was about being legible to power. So I made myself legible, but quietly. I began reframing my written communication, clear ownership statements, explicit scopes, calm but unmistakable language. I am responsible for. This decision was made based on the following risks were identified on date. No accusations, no emotional charge, just clarity. I also stopped shielding others from consequences. If a decision moved forward without my input, I let it. If a risk I had previously flagged resurfaced, I referenced the earlier note and asked how leadership wanted to proceed. I didn't fix things in the background anymore. I surfaced them in ways that required acknowledgement. Still, no one confronted me. No one asked why I had changed. They assumed this was a phase, or burnout, or maturity. What they didn't see was how these small shifts changed my position in the system. By documenting and clarifying, I was creating a parallel record, one that told a different story than the one being performed in meetings. A story where contribution and consequence were traceable, where work couldn't be fully detached from its origin without effort. I also noticed something else. I was no longer emotionally invested in being chosen. That freed me. When you're no longer chasing validation, you can observe dynamics without distortion. I saw how often decisions were made to preserve comfort rather than effectiveness, how promotions rewarded confidence over comprehension, how risk was quietly outsourced to people like me, and I saw where the leverage points were, not dramatic ones, structural ones. Certain processes depended disproportionately on institutional memory. Certain initiatives relied on undocumented knowledge. Certain people appeared confident because someone else was quietly ensuring they wouldn't be exposed, that someone had been me. They never noticed that I was identifying exactly where my absence would be felt. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but inevitably. Preparation isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like normal work done with a different intent. And while everyone else assumed the story was already written, that I was the dependable constant in the background, I was learning how stories actually get rewritten, not with force, with timing. The reveal didn't come with excitement. It came with stillness. I was reviewing an old project archive late one afternoon, not because anyone had asked me to, but because something in a recent meeting hadn't sat right. A timeline had been referenced with confidence that didn't match my memory. A dependency had been dismissed too quickly. I wanted to check the original assumptions. As I read through the documents, I realized how much of the institutional logic lived in places no one else ever visited. Drafts that never became final, notes that explained why a decision had been made, not just what was decided. Context that existed only because I had bothered to record it, and then it clicked. Several core processes, one's leadership considered stable, were stable only because of informal workarounds I had designed and maintained quietly over time. They weren't documented fully. They weren't owned by any one role. They lived in habits, in personal memory, in quiet adjustments made by someone who understood the system well enough to prevent friction. By me, I felt no rush of power, no sense of triumph, just a calm awareness of reality. If I stopped compensating entirely, if I limited myself strictly to what was formally required, certain things wouldn't fail immediately. They would degrade. Questions would surface. Delays would appear. And when they did, the people currently credited with ownership wouldn't have the answers they were assumed to have. Not because they were incompetent, because the system had been built on invisible labor. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen, letting that sink in. This wasn't leverage in the dramatic sense. I couldn't expose anyone. I couldn't force a reversal, and I didn't want to. What I had was something quieter, clarity about where my presence actually mattered. For the first time, I understood the difference between being valued and being depended on. Dependence is dangerous when it's unacknowledged. I also realized something else, just as important. I didn't want to use this knowledge to punish anyone. That would tether me emotionally to a system I was already outgrowing. The leverage wasn't about control. It was about choice. I could continue as I was and accept the role assigned to me. I could attempt to renegotiate it directly, knowing how those conversations often go. Or I could reposition myself entirely, on my terms, with my record intact. That clarity was sobering. I closed the archive and opened my notebook. I didn't write a plan. I wrote constraints. What I would not do. I would not threaten. I would not reveal information out of context. I would not create chaos to prove a point. What I would do. I would stop performing invisible labor. I would align my efforts strictly with formal accountability. I would protect my integrity and my future, even if that made others uncomfortable. There was a quiet grief in that moment, not for the job, but for the version of me that had believed patience alone was enough. That version had worked hard. She had meant well. She had trusted the system more than she should have. I felt respect for her, not embarrassment. The reveal wasn't that I had power. It was that I had been giving it away. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. I packed up my things that evening with a sense of calm resolve. No adrenaline, no fantasy of vindication. Just the understanding that whatever I chose next would change the trajectory permanently. Not because I would make noise, but because I would stop absorbing silence. Knowing where you stand doesn't immediately tell you where to go. For several days after that realization, I lived in a kind of internal stillness. I did my work. I attended meetings. I listened. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, I weighed options with a seriousness I hadn't allowed myself before. There were 3 paths in front of me, and none of them was comfortable. The first was to stay and continue as I was, perhaps with firmer boundaries, perhaps with a bit more visibility, but fundamentally within the same structure. I could accept the role I'd been assigned and find satisfaction in stability. There was safety in that option, predictability. I knew how to succeed there, even if success meant remaining in place. The second option was to confront the issue directly, to request a conversation about recognition, scope, and advancement, to present evidence, articulate contributions, and ask to be seen differently. I'd seen how those conversations played out for others. They required the other party to admit oversight or bias. They often resulted in reassurances rather than change. And even when they succeeded, they altered how you were perceived, no longer quietly competent, but demanding. Political. I wasn't afraid of speaking up. I was skeptical of the cost-benefit. The third option was the one I hadn't previously allowed myself to consider seriously. Leaving. Not impulsively, not dramatically, but deliberately. Repositioning my career outside a system that had already defined me too narrowly. That option scared me the most. Not because I doubted my ability, but because it meant letting go of familiarity, of relationships, of the comfort that comes from being needed, even if that need is asymmetrical. I spent evenings walking through my neighborhood, replaying conversations, imagining outcomes. I asked myself hard questions. Was I reacting emotionally? Was I avoiding discomfort? Was I giving up too easily? What grounded me was the realization that staying without change would slowly erode my respect for myself. I could feel it already, in the quiet resentment I had worked so hard to rationalize away. Confrontation might have offered temporary validation. Leaving offered alignment. The decision came one morning as I watched a new hire being introduced in a team meeting. Bright, enthusiastic, clearly being groomed. I recognized the pattern immediately. The early signals, the exposure, the language used to describe potential. I realized then that even if I fought for space now, I would always be catching up to a narrative already written for me. That was the moment I chose. I wouldn't announce my dissatisfaction. I wouldn't demand recognition. I would step out of the role entirely, on my own terms, with my reputation intact. The choice was irreversible, not because of any formal action yet, but because of what it changed internally. Once I decided to leave, the system lost its emotional grip on me. I stopped hoping it would become fair. I began preparing quietly, updating my resume with language that reflected what I actually did, not what my title suggested. Reaching out to a small, trusted network, exploring opportunities that valued depth and ownership rather than performance. At work, I remained professional, present, calm. No one sensed the shift. Why would they? I had always been composed. My silence had long been mistaken for acceptance. But the difference now was that I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I was choosing myself. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down and sharpened. I didn't rush. I didn't fantasize about exit speeches or imagine reactions. I treated the next phase the same way I treated complex work problems, methodically, privately, without unnecessary disclosure. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy. It was about containment. I began by tightening my boundaries at work even further. I adhered strictly to my role description. If something fell outside it, I asked clarifying questions in writing. If a task lacked ownership, I asked who was accountable. Calm questions, neutral tone, no subtext. This alone shifted dynamics more than I expected. Small delays appeared, not failures, just pauses where I used to step in automatically. People waited for answers that didn't come immediately. Meetings ended with loose ends. Follow-ups increased. Still, no one connected it to me. They framed it as growing pains, competing priorities, and normal friction. I didn't correct that assumption. Outside the office, my life grew unexpectedly focused. I updated my resume slowly, line by line, stripping out modesty and replacing it with accuracy. I described outcomes, not effort. Decisions, not support. I didn't exaggerate, but I also didn't minimize. I practiced telling my story out loud, refining it until it felt clean and true. Not a grievance narrative, a clarity narrative. I build systems that scale quietly. I specialize in risk reduction and operational continuity. I've led complex initiatives without formal authority. Those statements felt strange at first, too bold. Then they felt honest. I reached out to people who had seen my work up close, former colleagues, cross-functional partners. I didn't complain. I asked how they described my strengths to others. Their answers confirmed what I already knew and what my current environment hadn't reflected. At work, Evan continued to gain visibility. He led updates. He fielded questions. He spoke with increasing confidence about areas he partially understood. I watched without judgment. This wasn't about him anymore. What struck me was how little curiosity there was about my internal state. I had been central for so long that my gradual withdrawal registered as background noise, not a signal. Dependable people are often assumed to be fine until they're gone. There was a meeting where a decision was made that directly contradicted a risk I had documented months earlier. I referenced the note calmly and asked how leadership wanted to mitigate it. There was a pause, not because I was wrong, but because no one had expected me to surface it so plainly. The decision stood. I nodded, made a note, and moved on. That moment mattered, not to them, but to me. It confirmed that I was no longer responsible for steering outcomes I didn't own. The silence I was moving in wasn't passive. It was disciplined. I also began transferring knowledge carefully, not dumping it, not hoarding it, just documenting processes as requested, without the extra intuition and foresight I used to add unprompted. The work became literal instead of anticipatory. Efficiency dipped slightly. Again, no one panicked. The system had relied on invisible buffers for so long that it mistook their absence for noise. Weeks passed. Interviews happened quietly. Conversations unfolded that felt different, direct, respectful, curious. People asked how I thought, not just what I'd done. They listened. For the first time in a long while, I felt fully seen. Not because I demanded it, but because I chose environments where it was natural. At work, I remained the same Hazel they knew, calm, composed, professional. I met deadlines. I contributed when asked. I didn't burn bridges. They had no idea I was already halfway gone. And that, I realized, was the quietest form of power I'd ever held. The consequences didn't arrive as a crisis. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. A meeting that ran 10 minutes over because no one could answer a question that used to be resolved quickly. An email thread that went in circles before landing back on a decision I had documented months earlier. A process that needed revisiting, even though it had been stable for years. None of this was attributed to my change in behavior. It was attributed to growth, complexity, normal organizational friction. But I could feel the difference. People started asking more follow-up questions, just not always to me. They asked each other. They speculated. They assumed answers existed somewhere and just hadn't been surfaced yet. In one meeting, Evan hesitated mid-sentence while explaining a workflow. It was a pause I recognized immediately. The kind that comes when someone realizes they don't fully understand the mechanics beneath the summary. He recovered quickly. He always did. But the pause lingered in the room. After that, I noticed leadership asking for more written justifications, more timelines, more contingency planning, not because trust had disappeared, but because certainty had. The invisible scaffolding was gone. I was still there, still working, still professional. But I was no longer absorbing ambiguity. I was no longer translating risk into reassurance. And without that translation, the system felt less smooth. A manager stopped by my desk one afternoon and said, "Things feel a bit messier lately." I nodded and said, "There's a lot going on." It was true, and it was enough. What fascinated me was how no one traced the messiness back to labor that had never been formally acknowledged. They assumed something external had changed. Market conditions, team composition, priorities. They didn't assume the absence of quiet competence. In another meeting, a senior leader asked, "Do we have documentation on why this was set up this way?" There was a pause. Someone said, "I think Hazel might know." All eyes turned to me, not with authority, but with hope. I answered calmly. I referenced the document. I explained the rationale. I didn't volunteer additional fixes. I didn't extend beyond the question asked. The relief in the room was palpable. And then the conversation moved on, without shifting ownership. That was the moment I understood something important. They didn't miss me. They missed the function I had been performing silently. And because that function had never been attached to my role explicitly, its absence couldn't be addressed directly. Evan began looping me into conversations again, but differently now, more cautiously, as a resource, not a collaborator. I answered when asked. I stayed within bounds. I could sense frustration building, not anger but unease. the kind that arises when confidence outpaces comprehension. Still, no one asked me what had changed. They were feeling the consequences without understanding the cause, and I wasn't hiding it. Everything I did, or didn't do, was aligned with my formal responsibilities. There was nothing to accuse, nothing to confront. The system was encountering itself without its quiet buffer. What surprised me most was my own emotional state. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel guilty. I felt calm. Because I wasn't taking anything away. I was simply no longer giving more than was asked. That distinction mattered. By the end of that month, leadership scheduled a process alignment review, a broad initiative to understand why things felt less predictable. I was invited, of course. I attended. I listened. I contributed factually. And all the while, I knew something they didn't. The loss they were experiencing wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was a signal they had missed too long ago. By the time they realized something was wrong, they still didn't understand what it was. The process alignment review became a recurring meeting, then a working group, then a set of action items that circled the same questions without landing anywhere solid. Leadership sensed instability, but not its source. They were trying to stabilize symptoms while the cause remained unnamed. I watched it unfold with a strange sense of detachment. The questions became more pointed. Why does this take longer now? Who owns this end to end? Why wasn't this risk surfaced earlier? Each question skimmed the surface of an answer that already existed, but required an uncomfortable acknowledgement to reach. That acknowledgement never came. Instead, there was a subtle escalation of urgency. More meetings, more check-ins, more pressure on visible leads to an upward trend. Evan in particular looked increasingly strained. Not overwhelmed, uncertain. I didn't feel satisfied watching that. I felt recognition. He wasn't failing. He was being exposed to the same structural blind spot I had lived inside for years, expected to own outcomes without being given the full context that made ownership real. One afternoon, my manager asked if we could talk. It wasn't formal. It wasn't framed as a problem. He closed the door and said, "You've always had a good sense of how things fit together. Do you feel like anything's off lately?" It was the closest anyone had come to asking the right question. I chose my words carefully. "I think we're seeing the difference between documented processes and lived ones," I said. "There's a lot of institutional knowledge that isn't fully captured." He nodded slowly. "Do you think we should try to capture it?" I paused. "Some of it can be documented," I said. "Some of it only exists because of how people operate day to day." He didn't press further. That was the moment I knew it was too late. Not because the knowledge couldn't be written down, but because the system had never valued the conditions that produced it. They wanted the output without acknowledging the labor that made it possible. Shortly after that conversation, a promotion was announced. Evans. The timing was almost surreal. It was clearly meant to stabilize things, to reaffirm leadership, restore confidence, signal control. Applause followed. Congratulations were offered. Smiles held just a little too tightly. I watched from my seat, calm. The promotion didn't anger me. It clarified everything. This wasn't about correcting oversight. It was about maintaining narrative continuity. Changing the story would have required admitting that critical work had been undervalued and misattributed. That kind of reckoning rarely happens under pressure. After the announcement, people began coming to me more frequently, but not formally. Quiet check-ins, casual questions. "Just wanted your thoughts." "You've seen this before, right?" I answered within limits. And I noticed the shift in tone, less assumption, more appeal. But appeals without authority don't change structures. They change moods. The organization was trying to fix a foundation crack with surface reinforcement, and the people most affected could feel it. Deadlines slipped, decisions hedged, confidence wavered. Still, no one asked the question that mattered. Why was so much critical understanding concentrated in someone who was never positioned to lead? As for me, I had already accepted an offer elsewhere. Signed, dated, done. I didn't announce it yet. I didn't need to. The moment had passed for negotiation, for recognition, for repair. Even if they had offered me something then, it would have been reactive, not reflective. Too late, not because they couldn't change, but because I already had. The conversation happened on a Thursday morning, quiet and unremarkable, just like most things that matter. I had scheduled a time with my manager under the pretense of a routine check-in. No dramatic subject line, no hint of what was coming. When I walked into his office, I noticed the familiar details, the framed leadership quote on the wall, the half-empty mug cooling on his desk. He smiled, relaxed. He had no reason not to be. We talked briefly about timelines, about the ongoing review, about how busy things felt. Then I told him I had accepted another position and would be giving my notice. There was a pause, not the startled kind, but the kind where someone's internal model suddenly stops working. He blinked once. "Oh," he said. "I didn't realize you were looking." "I wasn't at first," I replied. The room stayed calm. No raised voices, no defensiveness, just the quiet recalibration of expectations. He asked where I was going. I told him. He nodded slowly. "That's a strong role," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't know you were interested in something like that." I met his eyes. I've always been interested in work like that. That was the closest thing to confrontation there was. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "Is there something we could have done differently?" I considered the question seriously. Not to punish him with honesty, but to answer it cleanly. "I think there were opportunities for my work to be seen differently," I said. "But I also think the system had already decided what role I played." He nodded again, slower this time. There was a moment, brief, restrained, where I could see the realization forming, not guilt, recognition, the understanding that something valuable had been misread, not maliciously but thoroughly. "We'd like to make a counter-offer," he said after a pause, "or at least talk about options." "I appreciate that," I said, "but my decision is final." No anger, no relief, just certainty. He asked if there was anything I wanted to share as feedback. I gave him one thing, not a list. "Dependability can hide potential," I said, "especially when it's taken for granted." He wrote it down. We talked through transition plans, knowledge transfer, timelines, all practical, all professional. At no point did he ask me to reconsider by appealing to loyalty or history. He knew better. When I left his office, I felt lighter, not because I had won anything, but because I hadn't had to fight. Word spread quietly. People stopped by my desk with surprised expressions, some with warmth, some with confusion, a few with regret they didn't know how to articulate. Evan congratulated me. "Genuinely, I think," he said. "You'll be great there." "I know," I replied, and meant it. There was no reckoning scene, no apology tour, no dramatic shift in power dynamics, just the quiet acknowledgement that something steady was leaving. And that was enough. Because confrontation doesn't need heat to be effective. Sometimes the calmest truths land the hardest. I don't think of that period as something I escaped from. I think of it as something I outgrew. In my new role, the difference wasn't louder meetings or bigger titles. It was orientation. From the first week, people asked me not just what I thought, but how I arrived there. They wanted context. They wanted judgment. They wanted the parts of my thinking that had once lived only in the margins of documents. I didn't have to translate myself. That was the biggest change. I noticed how little energy I spent managing perception. No rehearsing when to speak. No calculating whether a comment would sound too much or too quiet. I wasn't bracing myself against invisibility or overexposure. I was simply present, fully. And with that presence came a different sense of responsibility. In the past, I had equated responsibility with endurance, holding things together quietly. Now, responsibility meant shaping outcomes openly, saying no when something was misaligned, naming risk without cushioning it for comfort. I didn't feel the need to prove myself. The work spoke, yes, but this time it spoke with my name attached. What surprised me most was how little resentment I carried with me. I had expected some residue, some lingering bitterness. It never arrived. I think that's because I didn't leave in anger. I left with understanding. I can see now that the people I worked with before were operating on incentives they didn't question. They weren't villains. They were participants in a system that rewards confidence over care, visibility over depth. I had been very good at care. Now I was also allowed depth. I still work hard. I still stay late sometimes, by choice, not default. But I no longer confuse sacrifice with virtue. I don't assume that effort entitles me to recognition. I make recognition part of the structure. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing where your work begins and ends, from being able to step away without fear that everything will collapse, or worse, that no one will notice. I keep the same leather-bound notebook, not as armor, as a reminder. It holds patterns, not grievances, observations, not scores, Sometimes I think about the version of myself who stayed late every night, believing patience would be rewarded. I don't judge her. I respect her discipline, but I no longer ask her to carry the future alone. Who I am now is not louder. I'm clearer, clear about my boundaries, clear about my value, clear about when silence serves me and when it doesn't. And most importantly, be clear about this. Being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you never change the conditions that allow it. I did, quietly. There's a version of this story that could end with vindication, with regret expressed too late, with someone finally admitting what should have been obvious all along. This isn't that version. What I learned didn't come from being proven right. It came from understanding how easily quiet people can be mistaken for content ones, and how often systems confuse reliability with limitation. Hard work wasn't wasted in my story. It just wasn't rewarded where I placed it. That distinction matters. Effort isn't a currency you deposit and wait to see returned. It's an energy exchange. And when the structure you're in doesn't know how to measure what you give, it will take it indefinitely without malice. That doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. For a long time, I believed that staying late, filling gaps and smoothing over problems was proof of character. And it was. Just not the kind that leads to advancement in environments built on visibility and narrative. What changed my life wasn't working less. It was working with intent. I stopped assuming that being indispensable would make me irreplaceable. I stopped equating silence with professionalism. I stopped waiting for fairness from a system that rewarded clarity of ownership, not quiet excellence. And when I moved on, I didn't burn bridges or demand apologies. I left the same way I had worked, calmly, thoroughly, without spectacle. That choice preserved something important, my respect for myself. If there's a moral here, it's not be louder or play politics. It's this. If your contribution isn't legible to the people who decide outcomes, it will not protect you, no matter how essential it feels. Quiet dominance isn't about outmaneuvering others. It's about refusing to give your depth to structures that can't hold it. Before I end, I want to ask you something, especially if parts of this story felt familiar. Have you ever realized that you weren't failing? Were you simply being relied on too silently? If so, I'd love to hear how that realization changed, or might change, the way you move forward.